before the COVID-19 outbreak. 5 points. Firstly, on December the 6th, 2019, OPEC increased its cuts by from 1.2 to 2.1 million barrels per day till March the 31st, 2020, in order to reduce the oversupply already present in the market. This is a very important point. In January 2020, world oil demand reached 100 million barrels per day. On January the 8th, 2020, Brent and WTI respectively traded at $70 and $63 per barrel in the wake of the US-China Phase 1 agreement. On March the 6th, 2020, before the COVID-19 outrage, Russia refused Saudi proposal to further rise cuts by 1.5 million barrels per day, while Saudi Arabia rejected Russian proposal to extend the previous deal for the entire 2020. Last but not least, in early April 2020, Saudi Arabia increased its output to 12.3 million barrels per day. I would like now to describe the COVID-19 effect on oil market, starting from the oil market report, demand. As you can see from this chart, in April 2020, world demand fell by approximately 30 million barrels per day, while 2020 global demand is forecast to drop by 9 million barrels per day. The COVID-19 effect on benchmark prices during March-April 2020, barrel prices dropped to their historic lows. Brent reached $9 per barrel on April the 21st, while WTI lowered to minus $37 per barrel the day before. This is the COVID-19 effect on US stocks. The source is the Energy Information Administration. US commercial stocks surged from 469 million barrels at the end of March 2020 to more than 534 million barrels on May the 22nd, 2020. This is our latest data. And this is the effect of COVID-19 on global economy. The source is the International Monetary Fund. In 2020, global GDP is forecast to shrink by more than 3%. The OPEC plus agreement was the response to the fall in demand, especially on April the 12th, 2020. OPEC Plus reduced the output by 9.7 million barrels per day, starting from May-June 2020. Non-OPEC Plus members will contribute with additional cuts estimated between 5 and million barrels per day. And due to the implementation of those cuts, in May 2020, barrel prices increased by $16 per barrel, as you can see from the chart below, reaching $35 per barrel. However, prices stand between 41 and 49% less than the beginning of 2020. The rebalancing of the oil market will depend on 4 factors, especially on 4 factors. The second wave of COVID-19 saw a new round of lockdowns, the future of the US-China relationship, the US fracking trend, and 2020 China's oil demand. In particular, with regard to the third and fourth point, I would like to highlight that the US output, especially the US fracking activity, decreased from 13.1 million barrels per day on March 13, 2020, which was the historic maximum, to 11.4 million barrels per day on May 22nd, 2020. Then, in 2020, China's oil demand, which is estimated to increase by 2% in 2020, while consumptions will increase between 1 and 2%. It probably means that China is ramping up its storage capacity. And this is a very important point from a geopolitical point of view. My conclusion is that if a second wave of COVID-19 doesn't spark and the US-China relationship doesn't derail, prices may recover at around $40 a barrel in the third quarter of 2020. However, high volatility is not to be excluded as the present days, while the oil market will probably need more time in order to rebalance. Thank you,
Thank you very
Alessandro.
much, Demosthenes. Thank you very much. This was, a very good all-round overview. I'm sorry I couldn't join timely, but Zoom played one of his tricks.
Yeah.
I would like now to give the floor, please, to Mr. Al-Haji, so that we can proceed. Mr. Al-Haji, the floor is yours. Thank you. Shukran.
Please let me know whether you are hearing me well or not before I start. Do you hear me well?
Yes, quite well.
Right, thank you. I have two comments, one short-term and one long-term. Short-term, Saudi Arabia and Russia has already agreed on extending the cut of 9.7 for additional month, contingent upon compliance by all other members. And what does that mean? We have to wait until we see the meeting and realize what does it mean, full compliance for all members. But we are already above $40 in terms of Brent, and if this continues and the recovery continues, it is very clear that prices will go even higher. Long term, I would like to point out to an issue that is completely ignored by analysts and the media. We have the shale hype, we have the electric vehicles hype, we have the renewable energy hype that is hyped by certain organizations, by the media, and by politicians. When we have politicians talking about energy dominance and energy independence and we don't need your oil, what's being ignored is the response of oil producers. Everyone is focusing on those statements, but people ignore how those producers are reacting to such hype or to such statements. And the best way to describe what we've seen from producers is the following. I labeled the policies with the name of animals. We ended up with 4 policies that will have extreme and tremendous impact on the energy markets in the coming years. And we have to pay attention to them starting today. Otherwise, we are going to end up with a massive energy crisis. Those producers basically are reacting in the form of what I call the lion's policy, the tiger's policy, the rabbit policy, and the fox policy. The lion policy basically is to ignore all the hype and to ignore what everyone is saying and say, you know what, I'm going to do what I can do best, is drill for oil, produce oil, and that's it. Now, this policy is practiced by some members, but not all the time. But this type of policy is weakening, especially in the last 2 years. That brings us to the tiger policy. The tiger policy basically is an attack policy. And we already seen it when the major oil producers literally crash the market, lower prices, and let everyone else deal with it. Let the electric vehicle industry deal with it. Let the renewable industry deal with it. Let the politicians like Trump and others deal with it. And that's the tiger policy. We already seen it, but we know this policy is not sustainable. It is probably good to remind people what they are talking about and what type of policies to adopt. And it reminds other producers not to mess with the major producers. The third policy is the ravage policy. This is adopted mostly by small producers where they believe all the hype. They know oil demand is going to peak one day. They know that it's going to decline after that. Say, what the heck, I'm going to produce as much as I can at any price I can and run away, just like a rabbit. The most important policy and the most influential policy is the Fox policy. The Fox policy is when the major oil producing countries adopt energy intensive industries like petrochemicals and say, you know what, if you don't want my oil, I am going to export it to you embedded in something else, such as petrochemicals and plastic. This phase already been done. It's a done deal. We have countries like Saudi Arabia being one of the major exporters of petrochemicals with one of the largest complexes of petrochemicals in the world. We already seen other countries doing the same. But now we are moving toward another stage, which is oil to materials, which is literally manufacturing materials that we manufactured from wood or sand. And instead of making it from wood or sand or other materials, basically literally making it from oil. And moving from oil to materials is going to have profound impact on the oil market. Here is why. Because if policymakers in Europe and the United States and Asia do not deliver on what they promised in terms of shying away from oil, they don't deliver on electric vehicles, they don't deliver on shale, they don't deliver on renewables, then we are going to end up with a massive shortage. And with massive shortage, prices will go up. But higher prices are not enough incentive to the manufacturers of materials to sell the crude oil, because now they have to stop their factories. The only way they can provide that oil if oil prices increase substantially in a way where they start making more profit selling crude than to make it from factories. So the conclusion here is, regardless of what we had now in terms of decline in production, decline in shale production because of lower investment and higher decline rates, that's going to lead to energy crisis. On top of this energy crisis, we are going to have another energy crisis because of the reaction of the oil producers to policymakers in the West and to the hype of other things. I say this for the following reason. People forget one fact, that most of the numbers you see about the impact of electric vehicles on oil demand is hype. Notice I did not say they are hyping the numbers of electric vehicles. I'm not talking about that. I believe we are going to have hundreds of millions of vehicles, of electric vehicles on the road by 2040 and 2050. But the impact basically is mismeasured, because there are reports out there that are counting switching from CNG and LNG as switching from oil. And the margin is large. So the forecast basically and the impact on oil is exaggerated. Thank you.
This is really, you know, something quite interesting because you are talking about the fact that one thing is, you know, to see the transition, and the other thing is what is behind the transition. Basically, you say until energy intensive industries don't make a transition, and until the way plastics are produced doesn't make a transition, there is still a certain stability in the supply, you know, of fossil fuels, especially oil. So that's, you know, quite...
May I add one more point, please?
Yes, please.
The idea here is, even if these are not hype and these are real, the idea here is, yes, go ahead and produce your electric vehicle. I will make sure that all the materials that make the electric vehicle is made from my oil. All those wind turbines you are making, I will make sure that the materials used for those wind turbines are made from oil. So either way, the demand for oil will be there. The additional point is, if you look at 2050, from now to 2050, to keep demand, oil demand as is at 100 million, which was the demand in 2019, to keep it the same in 2050, we need 700 million electric vehicles on the road by that time, which is one of the highest numbers out there. So which means that even with heavy penetration of electric vehicles, we still have 100 million of oil in the market by 2050. Here is the problem. Between now and 2050, because of the decline rates, we need another 100 million barrels of fresh oil to keep it at 100.
No, I agree fully. You know, I understand what you say, and you're just, you know, making and repeating more forcefully your point. In fact, it means when we call transition, it's not just a Green Deal. It is much more. In a certain sense, Ms. Thunberg has understood much better the transition than Mrs. von der Leyen, but that's life. I would like now to pass the floor to Nicolas Mazzucchi, and I'm more than interested in having his own view. Please.
Many thanks, and first of all, many thanks for the invitation to participate to this webinar. First of all, I would like to go a little bit before the COVID crisis, as Demosthenes started to present, to go deep inside this oil prices war between Saudi Arabia and Russia, because I think that it's a very important element, not really for today, but for the future of the oil market. Looking at the OPEC plus format is very interesting, because OPEC by itself is now making more or less than 40% of the world's oil production, meaning that OPEC by itself is not having the weight it happened to have in the previous decade. So with the creation of this OPEC plus format, making Russia enter not really the OPEC, but being in the same time inside and outside the OPEC, so having an impact on the amounts of oil that are being put in the market, created a different geopolitical and geoeconomic situation within the oil producers. Before this situation, Saudi Arabia, as the swing producer of OPEC, was a kingmaker in oil production and in oil producing countries. But now, with Russia inside and with this OPEC plus format that is making nearly 60 to 62% of the world's oil production, so more than half in the world, it's creating a struggle between Saudi Arabia and Russia to determine who's the new kingmaker. Because Russia is playing a game not only in producing crude oil, but also in producing very large amounts of refined products on the one hand, but also in other energy elements on the other hand. For example, in uranium, in gas, in coal, and also in strategic metals for the energy transition. So Russia is having a game in its hand that is much more diversified than Saudi Arabia. So for me, this move from Saudi Arabia, because it's, in my opinion, Saudi Arabia that's starting this oil prices war, it's the idea to create some kind of new game ball. That was the first game ball in 2014 inside the OPEC that was won by Saudi Arabia against countries like Algeria, against Venezuela, that were considered some kind of clandestine passengers. And now Saudi Arabia was trying at the eve of 2020 to play this new game with Russia in order to to maintain its position as the kingmaker in the oil producers. So it's this idea that it's very important to understand that now Saudi Arabia is struck between Russia and the United States in the global landscape of oil producing countries, and that this position between the three major producers, so Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the United States, will continue after this COVID crisis and will continue to determine the struggle in the oil producing landscape. And then to link with Anna's presentation, of course, it's also very important to consider this Fox policy from Saudi Arabia to switch from a simple crude oil producer to also an exporter of refined products and of plastics, of petrochemicals, and so on. So there is also this transition in Saudi Arabia to be able to gain another weight in this competition between the three main producers. Looking at the COVID impact by itself, COVID crisis also highlighted the need for plastics and the importance of petrochemicals and petrochemistry all over the world. So that I don't know if the wall of petroleum is fading, but clearly the wall of petrochemicals is still there, and for a large number of years. Anna, so we're talking about electric vehicles, but if we look at renewable energy sources, for example, to build a wind turbine or to build solar panels, you need plastics, so you need oil, and that's a very important fact that have to be kept in mind. And looking at this potential post-COVID issue that is mostly unforeseeable, as Demosthenes stated, there is this unforeseeable potential second wave and potential further lockdown. But looking at the post-COVID situation, especially in the West, there is a foreseeable economic crisis. So there is a starting economic crisis all over the world that will force consuming states to look at the cheapest energy sources in order to maintain their own economy. So oil in this perspective, but I think in Europe, especially gas, will be considered with a very important policy, will be considered, excuse me, by policymakers with a very important look. And I don't know if it will happen, but I think there are a very important risks for the Green Deal and the European Commission, and also for the whole political issue of the von der Leyen Commission, because the Green Deal has been considered the cornerstone of the von der Leyen Commission global agenda. So will there be a lack of funding for the Green Deal? It's possible. And already some countries, especially Eastern European countries, are now more and more looking at gas solutions and also in investing more in also in oil. And the last point I would like to highlight regarding this situation and this COVID situation, it's the difference in strategy, not for countries, but for companies, and especially for IOCs. Until the previous months, IOCs were having globally a single business model. And now we are experimenting the creation of two different business models within IOCs. The first one is the idea to diversify activities. It's the total business model, for example, taking into account that with the COVID crisis, with the need to accelerate the energy transition, oil companies, especially international oil companies, have to diversify their activities and to invest in electricity production, in energy efficiency, and so on. And most of the European IOCs are taking this path. So Total was the first one, but also Repsol, BP, and so on. And on the other end, we are also experiencing IOCs that are following with business as usual, and especially the American ones, ExxonMobil, Chevron, Texaco, and so on. So as this landscape of IOCs is starting to have a very important divergence in its business model, it could also have very important impacts also on the oil market, because IOCs were an important backbone of the oil market, and having a diversification that is going on with companies that tomorrow, we don't know, may be also undertook by the American ones, may also have an important impact on this market for the West. And I totally agree with Demosthenes with this idea that China and Chinese consumption will be the driver for the oil prices, because if we are also experiencing this idea of changing the business models in the IOCs, the Chinese national oil companies that are now as powerful, economically speaking, than traditional IOCs will be more and more influent in traditional areas of oil production, especially Middle East, Africa. They are now very important in this area, but with the change of business model from European IOC, they could be more and more important and have an influence and pave the way for global Chinese influence, especially in the Gulf region, that could be more and more important, and that could change some strategic landscape and strategic relation between the different actors in the region and globally in the oil production landscape. Thank you.
Very much, Nicolas. It was really, you know, I'm very happy, you know, to have that sort of panel, because we had four diverging, converging, unconventional views. So that's exactly what I like. I don't like to go with the crowd. Sorry, mainstream really doesn't interest me, and I suspect also our public. Now, I would like to make some questions. You know, the first round of questions from the moderator. I will start with, you know, what I felt before this this webinar was, okay, energy transition, but please have a look at the transition of energy producers. Because if we go in a linear way, in the sense that prices are still low, and here will be some of my questions, are really these prices viable for the states that are producing? In other words, I don't like to have a Venezuela with 6,000 nuclear warheads around, and possibly another civil war, you know, 1918, 1922. So this is a sort of Mad Max scenario I really don't like. But even if it would be a quote unquote minor scenario in the Middle East, well, no, I'm not enthused. I'm working, you know, starting from your market considerations, I'm trying to shift, you know, to the political implication of that. I would like to start with Demosthenes. You know, the market will change, and the question is how, you know, because there is a shift apparently from some sort of producers to other types of decision makers. But what are the political implications of that? Oil markets are always political, but probably they are becoming more and more political. And this depends very much from the policymaker or the policymaking elite.
Yeah.
Please.
Can you hear me, Alessandro? Yeah. If I can, I would like to add something to Nicolas' speech, which was very interesting for me. And I would like to say that for me, the real problem, both for the Russians, Nicolas, and the Saudis, is the increasing in US fracking production. Because every time Russians and Saudis reduced their output between November 2016 and November 2019, the US grabbed their market share. So I think that this is, from a geopolitical point of view, the real turning point. And only after this issue, unfortunately, we had the COVID-19 outbreak. With regard to the next oil market, I prepared another slide. I think that it will be characterized by the following three characteristics. First of all, the presence of majors with high quality assets, and the downsizing, maybe the expulsion of those without real value. And of course, when I talk about major with high quality, I'm talking about Saudi Aramco, I'm talking about Russian Rosneft, of course, especially about them. Then the second point is a process of concentration and centralization of the capital, of the energy capital. And I think that this second point will especially involve the North American oil and gas market, not only oil, but gas too, such as the offshore sector in the North Sea. And last but not least, the transition of the ownership from private to public, more than the transition from fossil fuels to renewables, as other analysts wrote during last weeks, supported, this is a very important point from a political point of view, of course, supported by the presence of the national oil companies and their national sovereign and their sovereign funds. And when I'm talking about sovereign funds, I would like to highlight that taking into account the ranking of the first 10 world sovereign funds, in terms of worth, 4 out of 10 are Chinese funds. So I think that this is another important political point. Can you hear me?
Yeah. No,
okay.
I hear you. Thank you, Demosthenes. Very interesting. You know, I was just taking a couple of notes, and to Anas, you know, I would like to turn my question with the observation that this is a late vengeance of Mossadegh through other means. You know, national oil companies coming back, but with sovereign funds. So, you know, the poor Democrat at that time couldn't imagine that, but you know, we've done all this effort, you know, in saying, no, it must not be, now comes back. Okay. How do you think, you know, major producers in the Gulf, and principally, you know, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, can fare further with these $40 more or less per barrel? Because, you know, margins are quite little, and fiscal revenues are vital. And this is, of course, you know, what you answer for Saudi Arabia is also important for, you know, other producers, more or less. Please, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. I would like to go back to your comments earlier about the unconventional views and the introduction you made for the second session. When you talk about transition of energy producers or oil producing countries, they are making the transition in various ways, and one of them basically is they are adopting renewable energy on their own. I mean, just look at UAE and look at Saudi Arabia, look at Algeria, for example. And the importance of that, making that transition, is it enables them to free their oil and gas for either personal domestic use or exports. That means if Saudi Arabia, for example, can free up 400,000 barrels a day, that's almost like a free oil that's going to be exported to the world. Without investing a single penny, they can switch that from domestic use to the international market. Because you mentioned something about cost and what they can do with lower prices. Well, this is one way of doing it. If they can use solar and they can switch the use of oil from the domestic utilities and export that oil, they can do it without any additional investment. The second point is regarding wars and whether they can handle those prices or not, and then I will answer your question directly. If we look at the data historically, all wars and major political instabilities happen during high prices. Nothing really happened during low prices. During low prices, we have some demonstrations and we have some angry people, but that's it. But the major changes historically always happen during high prices. So politically, it seems that the political change and the other political instabilities happening during high prices, and therefore that give us a different meaning. And there are many explanations in political science for that. One of it is when you have high prices, the stakes are very high. The cost of losing is extremely high because of that. To go back to your question, one of the misconceptions we have about the oil producers, and especially in the media, is that those countries need, let's say, $80. That's what basically be reported this morning. That Saudi Arabia needs $80 oil to balance its budget. This statement is completely useless. It does not mean anything. And the reason why, because when those countries do the budget, they do the assumptions for oil prices based on the forecasted or the expected revenues, not on the balance of the budget. So what we should look at is the price assumed for the revenues, regardless whether the budget is balanced or not. Second, we always underestimate the flexibility of those countries in terms of cutting spending, canceling projects, delaying projects, borrowing from domestic markets, borrowing from international markets. For the Saudis, they have way better ability than any other oil producers, except Norway, of course, than any other oil producers within OPEC Plus to be that flexible. Their domestic market ability to lend the government is better than anyone else because their domestic market is very rich and they can borrow. And then they have the other government organizations. I mean, we look at the retirement fund and others. They have a lot of money and they can borrow. The United States borrows from Social Security Fund. That's exactly what the Saudis can do. So the idea here is they can survive and they can do well with lower prices. When I say well, in a relative sense, I'm not saying this in an absolute sense. They can survive. The issue is for the population is growing and people are getting older. What that means is you need more education services, you need more health services, and therefore your spending on those will increase, and therefore you need more money. So you cannot sustain this low price for a very long time as the population basically grows older.
Thank you very much. Again, now I turn, the floor to Nicolas, and then we open the floor to the general questions. How do you think Russia is going to weather these low prices? Because I followed quite closely Anas when he said, $80, it's, pies in the sky. It's not really realistic. But already between 60 and 50, I had the impression, from as a geopolitical observer, if you like, that the situation started to become a bit tight. Now, Russia has reserves, but surely it has a very, very aging population. It's a demographic disaster. Just recently, they tried somehow to have a better life expectancy, but not really, a fertility ratio. And the same is with Ukraine. Please, Nicolas, the floor is yours.
Many thanks. Yeah, I agree with you. The situation is much more complicated for Russia regarding the oil situation. But the main difference between Russia and the other major oil producers is that Russia is not producing only oil. oil is the most important part of primary goods produced by Russia, but Russia is more and more relying on the production and exports of gas. And Russia is exporting gas mostly, barely 90% of the gas exported through gasoducts and through long-term contracts. So it's giving Russia some kind of economic stability, most important than it could be with only exporting oil. First of all. Secondly, we have to keep in mind that in Russia, the oil producing sector is barely 50% public, 50% private. It's not like in gas. In gas, Gazprom is making 80 to 90% of the market, and it's public.
If I may, Nicolas, this is the old Italian model of state-participated industry. We made Eni exactly the same way, so never mind.
Exactly. So in oil, the Russian state is having the upper hand over the transportation system. Transneft, which is managing all the oil pipelines in Russia, remains a 100% public company. But looking at the producing sector, Rosneft is public, for example, but Lukoil is private. So there is an important influence of the state over the companies. But having this only half public producing sector is very interesting for Russia. Secondly, also regarding the oil, Russia is exporting very large amounts of oil products, especially of petroleum refined products towards Europe and towards the Western countries. So Russia is still in overcapacity in refining, whereas European countries are under capacity because of the aging refineries in Europe, closing refineries in Europe because of social acceptance. So Russia is more and more exporting products. So is using this element, maintaining some kind of important revenues. But yes, looking only at the revenues in producing crude oil, Russia is having a point of equilibrium of oil prices higher than Saudi Arabia. It's nearly $50 barrel. It will be very difficult for Russia to maintain its level of revenue in oil. But due to this ability to balance with products in the oil and to balance with gas, to balance with strategic metals, to balance with coal, with uranium, also with wet and with all the agricultural primary goods that Russia is producing, it's creating some kind of not only oil superpower, but primary goods superpower. So there is a natural balance between one and the other that is allowing Russia to have some kind of ability to maintain a satisfying level of revenues, unless the crisis continued and the crisis became really global in the long term for all strategic primary goods, as it was in 2013, 2014.
Well, thank you very much. This gives, to me at least, the idea that the immobility of the 12 years of Mr. Super Putin shifts at least from primary producing energy to primary more diversified producing, but okay. To be fair, it's already something. It could be better, but you know, it's one has to do with what you know we have on the table.
Alessandro, may I add something with regard to Russia, to Nicolas' speech?
Just a second, because we have at least 8 questions.
Oh, okay.
No, you know, the public is absolutely, you know, keen on 8 and even more, I suspect, because yes, we have 10 questions. Okay. So please keep short, because so you know we start, you know, on coming to the question. The first is for Anas. How does crude quality play in your Fox strategy? I.e., will heavier crude grades fare better or worse in terms of price versus lighter products? Well, I leave you the floor.
It seems the person who asked the question, he knows the issues about crude quality that I discuss all the time. For those who do not know, the issue started in 2017 with the increase in shale oil production. As you all know, shale is light sweet, super light sweet, and condensate. And the IEA, the International Energy Agency, was forecasting a massive increase in the coming years in shale. And my view was this cannot happen because of crude quality. That shale produces mostly gasoline, while we know that gasoline demand in the long run will, or the growth at least, will be eliminated. So there'll be no growth because of electric vehicles and other things. And most of the growth in demand basically is on the heavier side. So therefore, we need the Saudi, Iraqi, Venezuelan, other oils, but not the shale. Therefore, that growth cannot happen. That's where this question came in. The issue we have here is the following. If this hype is true and it's not hype, and the electric vehicles and the others are going to take a lot of market share from oil, then shale will be hit first because the decline is going to come from gasoline, and shale produces mostly gasoline. So in terms of crude quality, shale will be hit, while the petrochemicals and others basically are used from the heavier oils, and therefore the crisis is more pronounced in this case because we needed the quality of oil that's been used to get the materials. We don't need the oil from shale. So the situation will get even worse.
I will now have another question, and it is for Demosthenes. Could you please elaborate on the concept that China is ramping up its oil stock? Which are the main strategic implications? I would also add, you know, being China such an important consumer, how do you see the geopolitical implications of that? Please.
Oh, this is a very interesting question, but unfortunately, I don't have an hour to answer to this important question. Well, I would like to show to our audience this slide. I think that is very interesting and that you can understand a lot of things. This is the International Labor Division, and the source is the Italian Manufacturers Association. The year is 2019. As you can see, 28.5% of industries produce in China, 17.2 in the United States. So we can't talk about energy without talking about industry. And in fact, if we analyze the tendencies of the economies of the GDP, on your left, you have the GDP in nominal terms, the United States with $21.4 billion, China with $14 billion. So the distance between them is decreasing year by year. But if you look on the right, there is GDP not in nominal terms, but in purchase power parity, and China is in the first place with $27 billion, and the United States is the second economy. This is the reason because China is the most important importer both of oil and natural gas. And in fact, if we analyze the exporters of the producers and the exporters of oil to China, in the first place we have Saudi Arabia, and in the second place Russia. Maybe they change the position month after month, but we are talking about 1.6, 1.7 million barrels per day exported towards China. which is exploiting this situation in terms of low prices in order to increase its strategic reserves. So I think that in this way, China is starting to, I don't want to say to win the game, but to lead the game.
Yeah, thank you very much, Demosthenes. So we have a leading China despite, you know, all the problems of this pandemic. I have a rather interesting question for Nicolas, and this time about, you know, financing energy. So on one hand, you have important investors like BlackRock divesting, at least partially, from fossils and going more or less green. And then you have central banks and other money producers that are trying to dematerialize money, which means also trying to invent perpetual bonds, something from Dominique Strauss-Kahn, for instance. As you see, I tailor the questions also to nationalities, so that you get out of this enormous debt bubble that is, you know, visible since 2006. How do you think, you know, will be on oil producer, better energy producers? What will be the impact from these different sorts of financing? Because generally, they tend to be still very much hard financed. Anas already told us that they can diversify lending, of course, cutting expenses, etc. They have also internal lending, but, you know, do you see something different, or, you know, more or less business as usual, but in a more sophisticated and greener and immaterial way? Thank you.
Many thanks. I think it will depend on the strategy of the different companies, and that's the first point. And I think that this diversification from the European IOC is also some kind of answer in terms of strategy to this idea of greening the finance. So they're also trying to green their business. More or less. Some of them, when you look at BP, for example, BP changed its logo more than, I think, 10 years ago in order to have some very little flour. Statoil changed its name to become Equinor because there was no more oil in the name of the company. So there are very different elements from some kind of nearly greenwashing to real diversification strategy. But that's for the traditional IOC. I think that the most important and the most strategic movement will be, in order to add what Demosthenes said about China, the idea that we're experiencing for a little bit more than 10 years a new category of oil companies between the national oil companies and the international oil companies, that are the international oil companies that are backed by a state. It was Petrobras that is now more or less out of this kind of international business, but that was very powerful in Western Africa. But it's now very important looking at the Chinese companies, looking at Sinopec, at CNPC, at CNOC, looking at the Indian companies also, because India will be also a very important player in the oil market for the post-COVID recovery, because of the increase in its consumption of oil and gas for now more than 20 years, but also in the development of in this international position. So these international oil companies that are public, that are backed by state, backed by sovereign funds, are, in my opinion, going to become the new most important players in the field, because they will have a direct access to finance, to the state finance, and not having to go that much on markets, so not very exposed to this risk of greening the finance, and they will be able to put very large amounts of funding to start new projects, as in the E&P, but also in refining, for example, and looking at what could happen with greening the finance with the traditional IOC, and decided that the Chinese, the Indian companies that are going more and more international, there could be a global change in the landscape, and having a more important rise of these companies. They experience a very important rise and very important development all over the world for the last 10 to 15 years. But I think that with this change in financing, their rise could be more and more important, because they will not experience this problem of financing themselves and of having to green themselves to have access to finance.
You are telling us that state backing is less ecological than being on the market, which is again paradoxical, you know, but it's interesting, you know, because you have different mixes and matches according to the situation of the concrete country. I have a couple of questions, which I will regroup for Anas concerning Iraq. What is doing Iraq? What sort of animal in your animal strategy is Iraq? And so please, the floor is yours.
All right, before I answer the question, I would like to, I have 2 comments on the previous questions, if you allow me, please. On China's strategic petroleum reserves. In the United States, the president and the Congress cannot use the strategic petroleum reserves to influence prices. The purpose of the strategic petroleum reserve is to be used during emergency, and therefore they cannot use it to manipulate prices. That's not the case in China. China has no rules for SPR. We don't know the exact size of it, but we can guess. The size is large, but China has already used it to manipulate prices. They are buying when prices are low, and they are selling when prices are high. Therefore, it's very hard to see $100 oil very soon under any circumstances, because China is going to use the SPR to flood the market and cap it. My guess is China will start using the SPR when prices exceed $75. So between 70 and 80, we are going to see a flood from China. That is important, because the moment China starts selling the SPR, it means that its imports will decline, and that's where the impact on oil producers and the market is going to happen. On greening the finance, there are a couple of issues here. The first message to all of those who are kind of shying away from investing in the oil sector, they are losing their place at the table. And if they are losing their place at the table, then they cannot contribute to the discussion. They just left the table. They are leaving it to others to determine what's going on. If they want to have an influence on the oil sector, they have to stay in. If they are on the outside, they have zero influence. The other thing is, some of the funds that withdrew or decided not to invest in shale in particular, they are the funds basically who ruined shale for us. We've been in shale since 2005. Everything was working fine. We got the shale oil. Everything was working fine. And when everyone started making money, other funds and other investors who know nothing about oil, they don't know the color of oil, they don't know the smell of oil, entered the business, and they ruined the business. And when they ruined it, basically, we got negative returns because of that. At the same time, they did not know how to deal with it. I'm not going to name names, but some of the funds basically that are trying to play kind of nice green boys, they are among the biggest losers in shale because they came in late in this case. On the international oil companies and expansion to energy, a couple of comments here. The first one is, I seriously believe that some companies have an identity crisis. They don't know what they are, and this is a big problem. Are you green? Are you blue? Are you black? Or whatever. There is an identity problem here. But I think we are misunderstanding what the oil companies are doing today. If you go back for the last 100 years or so, the majors, the oil majors, including the Seven Sisters, they try to control every new energy source. And they lost a lot of money on it, but they wanted to control it. So whatever we see today in terms of expansion to wind and solar and charging stations. This is not new to oil companies. Oil companies have been trying to control those sources for a very long time. If you go back to the 70s and when prices increased, every single new technology that came out to replace oil basically was bought by the oil majors. And they lost a lot of money, as you know, on shale oil, or oil shale, basically. As you know, oil shale is different from shale oil in Colorado and others. So what the oil companies are doing today is consistent with their behavior over the long term. What is not consistent is they always advocated free markets and they don't want government intervention. Yet when it came to renewable energy, they are surviving off government subsidies. So there is an issue here. In terms of Iraq and where it fits, Iraq does not fit. Iraq does not fit in any of those until it knows where it wants to fit. We have a serious problem. We already looked at the behavior in recent years. While the Iraqi government wants to play nice with Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and the rest of OPEC, a week later, they revert back to Iran, then they revert back to OPEC, back and forth, etc. And they did not abide by OPEC quota until today. And they are one of the major violators in this case. So in a sense, they are outlier any way you look at it, and therefore it does not fit in the analysis.
Thank you very much. Let's see other questions. There is a question on and I would like to put this to Demosthenes. Do actual reported inventory gains support the decline in demand of 30 million barrels a day in April and or May? So there are sometimes there are very specific questions, and then I will regroup a couple of questions concerning the Green Deal. Please, Demosthenes.
Yeah, so I think that this was this slide. And yes, as you can see in April, demand decreased in reality by more than 30 million barrels per day, maybe 33 million barrels per day. But fortunately, the implementation starting from May the 1st of the cut, as you can see in the other slide, increased our prices. Well, my opinion is that there is the possibility that demand, and now I'm talking about 2020 demand, will decrease more than 9 million barrels per day, because unfortunately, except in China, I don't see an economic recovery both in the United States and in Europe, and in Europe too. So from this point of view, I think that this data will change in the next 2 or 3 months. Of course, we will see the result of the meeting between the Saudis and the Russians, maybe at the end of this week or at the beginning of next week, and maybe the situation could change, but I'm not so much optimistic about it.
I have a question now for Nicolas concerning the Green Deal. there has been a lot of talk about the Green Deal. A number of critics have said, well, that's almost, it's not a big deal, almost non-existent. But how do you think its real impact will be? That is the big question.
Yeah, exactly. A very big question. I think that its impact will have to be assessed with the consequences of the COVID. The problem is that the Green Deal has been announced as to be the cornerstone of the von der Leyen Commission policy, all sectors included. And the problem is that we don't know if member states, but also the European Union, won't be forced to fund other sectors than renewable energy, than energy efficiency, in order to support the recovery of the whole European Union. So that will be the first problem. The second is that European Union wants to be greener than green for decades, and creating more and more energy climate packages that are having each time ambitions higher and that are nearly missed. If you're looking at the third energy package with the 2020 goals, there were 3 different goals. Reduction of 20% of the carbon emissions from 1990 basis. Okay, this one was made, but the 2 others, 20% level of renewable energy in the national energy mix was mixed. And the third one, 20% level of energy efficiency at the European level is missed also. And the problem is that the revision of this 2020 package that are the 2030 goals are even higher in terms of ambition. And the Green Deal is even higher than this revision of the third package. And the problem is that setting higher goals won't mean that you will have higher successes. And combining this idea to set more and more ambitious goals with this actual problem of financing the Green Deal in the post-COVID recovery will be, in my opinion, very difficult, especially with creating some kind of very flashy announcement, creating an Airbus of batteries. I don't know what this means, an Airbus of batteries. It means that we would gather 5, 6, 10 European companies in order to create batteries, whereas China is already making 80% of the batteries production and is securing the mining production of nearly the 2/3 of lithium and cobalt needed to produce batteries. I think it's nonsense. I think that Europe is trying to catch some trains that were already missed in the production of wind turbines, in the production of solar panels, in the production of batteries now. And I'm afraid that tomorrow it will also be in the production of green hydrogen.
May I add one comment, please? Alessandro, we cannot hear you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you hear me now? Yes,
Yes.
I hear you. Sorry. I will give you just a second. I wanted to add something to Nicolas. What I heard from you remembers me, eerily, what we already heard about, the European army. And it's 30 years that we get bigger and bigger goals, or apparently more concrete goals, and nothing much is moving. And the problem is with, procurement, defense sharing, whatever, task specialization and so on, there's nothing to catch up. We have the wherewithal, and we still are blocked. So that is really not nice. And I suspect this commission is continuing, on another track, the same problems. That's really not helpful. To Anas, yes, please. Just also the question, so you can, chain up with that. How do you see the oil landscape changing? And of course, it's the next few decades, I would say 20 years. You already talked a bit about that. consider the pressure from influential investors or back groups like Climate Action 100. Thank you, Hannes.
Okay, let's go back to the green issues. I'm fascinated by the unintended consequences of government policies. The earlier projects of green energy, they mostly replaced coal, and then as we went through time, they started replacing nuclear and natural gas. Now we are reaching a stage, because of government subsidies and because of this fascination with, and I like Nikolai comment about wanting to be green more than green, we are ending up with a situation where literally renewable energy projects are competing with renewable energy projects. They are no longer competing with gas and coal and nuclear. And newer projects, because they are cheaper, are competing with the older projects that are more expensive. So in a sense, there is a lot of waste of money in this case, and it needs some regulators basically to look into this before we put more or additional billions of dollars into these projects. Regarding the oil market, we have, and I'm talking about the outlook here, aside from the reaction of the oil producers, which I explained earlier, we have other problems. If you look at the forecasts, let's say the IEA, OPEC, and others, it is very clear, and I can prove this. Of course, I cannot prove it here, but I can prove this to anyone who doubts it, that they are exaggerating the size of shale over time and the production. They are exaggerating the impact of electric vehicles. They are exaggerating the impact of fuel efficiency of regular fuel or ICE vehicles. In fact, there is some sort of contradiction in those forecasts, which is very funny. If you take their forecast of fuel efficiency and you believe in it, there is no need for electric vehicles, because those fuel vehicles are going to be more efficient than electric vehicles based on their own forecast. So we have a serious problem here. So what we are going to end up with basically is oil demand is going to be higher than forecast, while supply is going to be way lower than forecast because of what I mentioned earlier. We are going to end up with an extended period of energy crisis and high prices. What we need a reliable, independent forecast for the long run, because both the IEA and OPEC are not reliable. They are both serving a certain agenda, or they are aspiring to serve a certain agenda, and therefore those forecasts are not reliable. The international oil companies, without naming names, they release their outlook, the one they want the public to believe in. They have about 12 scenarios. They pick up the one to invest on, that's secret. No one knows what that is. And then they pick up the one to share with the public. And you can see, if you study this, you can see the contradiction between the two scenarios. Their actions in the market versus what they told the public. And therefore, we don't have a reliable long-term outlook out there right now, except some few private ones. But the issue here is we are heading for energy crisis any way you look at it.
Thank you very much, Anas. I think we have, just 4 minutes, and I will try in the quite mission impossible to give some sense. But, the first thing that I would like to stress is that simplistic, linear, rosier doom and gloom scenarios don't work. The second is the market is one, but this world cannot be centralized as we would like or we would not like. We are in reality in a crisis of centralization of the world. It's not a problem of globalization per se. The problem on how you manage globalization. Now, oil, energy is a global business, no matter. It's not a matter if we use the dollar or the euro or Bitcoin. The problem is, what is the political perspective behind that? And we are lacking that. This is what I think you three, and also now lately Anna's underlined when you said, well, look, there is a crisis, no matter where you look at it, we have to face it. And the problem is there is no one-stop solution. This is, quite important because we have had a lot of discussion about multipolar worlds, which might be very nice for the proponents of multipolarism, but it's not the problem of the poles, the problem is how they interact, what sort of rules they have. And here we are in a dysfunctional multilateralism, which is, by the way, also hacked by some of the main actors. So again, we are more than in a transition. We are in a turmoil that, if mismanaged, can be terribly dangerous. The other important thing is, again, and I like very much this non-mainstream group of panelists, stop to think binary. Oil versus gas, green versus black. It's nonsense. There is a mix of opportunities from the different actors, be they consumers and be they producers. And this is something, there is another competition that is coming up, and you all told that. The producers will have to face sooner or later the competition of China, who is an importer, but will try, to go up the ladder of value, the chain of value, from other producers. Petrochemicals is a great classic. Again, as an Italian, I see that we had a very strong petrochemical industry and we blew it away. And it was a state-owned or state-participated thing. So this mix and match is not new. The last thing is that Europe again, or better, to be very frank, major European countries, because it's like the UN, it's useful to say, the Commission, etc. We know very well that the Commission has a function, but when it comes to governments, there are 5, 6 important countries. And it's incredible. They are behaving as if they were the great powers before 1914, and they are not. They should, unite, and they squabble exactly like, their opposite colleagues across the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf. It's counterintuitive. But in this sort of messy scenario that has been further complicated by the pandemic, we have to navigate trying to combine a longer term outlook, which is against, the fossils. It's against plastics. It's nice to have plastics, but plastics do pollute, or at least you have to have different plastics. And at the same time, we have to, it's like, driving a rally car. You have the foot both on the brake and the accelerator. There is no automatic gear. And on this note, I think we are on time. And I would like, first of all, to thank our attendants who were, profuse in questions and sometimes very precise questions. And I would like very much to thank our 3 panelists for the excellent contribution. Thank you very much, and I wish you a good evening. Buonasera, shukran, merci.
شكرا الله يعطيك العافيه.
Merci beaucoup.
Ευχαριστώ.
Παρακαλώ.
Καλησπέρα.
Are we all just the panelists on, or are we disconnected from the public?
Let's see if there is something else, but it should be shut at 30 on time. And if no, I have a question. There is a question, of course. So if there is extra time, since we started a bit later, to Anna's, the question is, the elephant in the room, Iran, what do they do?
We always have this thing, Iraq, Iran. And I just, it's funny to get the questions after each other like that. one of the problems we have right now is uh, Iran, generally speaking, they need the peaceful nuclear program to produce electricity so they can free up gas and oil for export. And again, I stress the word, they need the peaceful program. And the reason why, because historically, they learned a very valuable lesson from the Shah. It was domestic pressure that ousted the Shah. It wasn't the international pressure. So they can withstand the international pressure, but they cannot withstand the domestic pressure, and therefore they have to meet that domestic pressure and try to heed any crisis in this case. But from the US view, especially the Republicans and those who are on the right, anything that leads to political stability in Iran is viewed as support of the regime. And as long as it's viewed as stability of the regime, therefore that's against US policy. So the regime is looking at it as a source of stability, and the US is looking at it as a source of stability, and therefore this is a threat to the United States. And that's a problem cannot be solved.
I would like to add something more, and it is incredible because that sort of thing is going back to the 60s. You know, there is a certain persistence in, I don't know if bureaucracies, mindsets, administrations, to get it wrong with Iran. Because we all three understand very well that the stability of a country doesn't mean to favor automatically the regime. It's, for us, you know, it's evident. And now there is that sort of mindset that Iran is no. Whatever they do is no. Now, there are no saints. But stability in the Gulf means, and that was understood quite clearly by President Obama, to put Iran in the picture. It's, you know, no, it's, they tried, but then, you know, they changed idea. And this is unfortunately, you know, something that we are living the consequences right now. And by the way, it's something that is impacting directly on the stability of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Because, you know, one of the consequences is the war in Yemen, which is perfectly pointless. Yemen is a dark hole where already Nasser had some, you know, bad memories. And Egypt at the time was big and strong. And if, you know, the ruling class in the kingdom wants to concentrate on real problems, you concentrate on Iran and not on a sideshow. But, you know, if this is the waltz that people are playing around, well, this is exactly what we can't stop, unfortunately, but it is a net damage to everybody. You know, keeping Iran in that condition means to have problems automatically in Afghanistan, no matter if you have the peace with the Taliban or not.
The issue basically is, I mean, in my view, while we have the issue of nuclear, is being kind of sidelined by other issues, because really this idea of exporting the revolution since 1979 had been on their mind, and they already did export the revolution to Lebanon and Syria and Yemen, and they tried in Sudan and other places. So it was really the exportation of that revolution that kind of changed the dynamics of the Middle East and led to Saudi Arabia and others basically trying to stop them from doing so. Now we know they dominate in Iraq and they dominate in Syria and Lebanon, and they have a big role in Yemen. So the issue is not only, if you want to solve the Iranian issue, it's not only about nuclear, it involves that dominance. And from the Iranian view, if I have that dominance, why I have to give it up? And if I have to give it up, the price is going to be very high. So what you are going to give me in exchange to leave Syria and to leave Iraq? And it is very clear the price is very high that no one can afford.
We have just 1 minute more. So is any of the panelists wanting to have a parting shot, or otherwise I will do, you know, this horrible task myself. Okay, parting shot. Exporting revolution, yes, but unfortunately the local conditions asked for it. In Lebanon, it's quite clear. You know, it was a mismanagement, you know, of minority relations that helped in the end, first Amal, which was not so pro-Iranian, and then Hezbollah. Second thing is, when you dismantle completely Iraq, it was already foreseen by George Herbert Bush that it wasn't a great idea. Again, you know, the idea was good, but the management of the peace didn't jelly. And this is, I suspect that they would like to leave Syria, provided they have some reassurance. And it's now time really to cut, because we had some extra time. And I thank everybody again, and I wish you a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, Alessandro.
Bye. Bye to you. Bye to everybody.